Hello and welcome everybody. It's another News at 10, the second one of our ongoing series. And tonight we're going to be covering, as advertised, the links between the charity industrial complex and the activities of US and British imperialism, and what the usage of charity has been in the modern era. And we're going to be covering also the ongoing, of course, the situation in Ukraine, the Russian-NATO war there, this time focusing more on the diplomatic fallout and the proof of Western idiocy, and also looking at the many trials of a certain Donald John Trump and what they mean for the US imperialist political system going forward. And we are also going to be starting off, though, with a look at the issue that's come up with regard to the Grayzone and their attempt to fundraise via the platform GoFundMe. If you're not familiar with what this story is, the Grayzone site, of course, edited by Max Blumenthal, who we had on the podcast version of the show back when it was known as Red Star Radio, back in, I believe it was September of 2021, so nearly 2 years ago now. And he came on and we spoke about COVID quite a bit. And he's the editor of the Grayzone, this site which covers news from an anti-imperialist perspective. So I've spoken to Max Blumenthal before, been on his live stream. The journalist who we speak to quite a lot, Kit Clarenberg, he comes on the program quite a number of times and talks about a lot of the work that he's done on the Grayzone, which includes all of that expose work that he did on the British special operations and secret ops manuals that he got leaked to him, and look at the guilt of the British in the attacks on Russian civilian infrastructure, as this was all part of a plan that was drawn up and that Kit exposed in work for the Grayzone. And of course, this is what got him in hot water with our esteemed friends at the British Anti-Terror Squad, who apparently didn't seem to have actually read much of his work, given the line of questioning they put to him. But the key thing here is that, of course, that they attempted to do a crowdfunder to raise money to take on Kit Clarenberg, Wyatt Reed, and Alexander Rubinstein as permanent members of staff there. And of course, GoFundMe did a repeat of what they did to the Canadian truckers, which is that they essentially shut down the fundraiser, refused to pay out on it, and they specified they didn't specify. It was non-specific concerns that they were talking about, which basically, according to an interview that Max Blumenthal did with Jimmy Dore, was essentially taken to mean by him that somebody from the American security establishment had a word in the ear of GoFundMe and told them to shut it down. So the Grayzone, in the form of Max, actually has he's written up an article about this, which I would urge everybody to read. I'll post it in the chat. I'll also post it on the Patreon page when this episode goes out on audio. So they're now running a new fundraiser, and they're using another site which is more secure and less likely to crumble under pressure. Apparently that's called Spot Fund. And also Max is instructing people to write and complain to GoFundMe and get their money back. So something to be aware of there. The censorship industry never sleeps, it seems, and free speech is only free as long as, of course, nobody notices that you're doing it, which is the eternal rule. And I imagine that as soon as this platform, if it indeed it does go above a certain level, will get suppressed pretty quickly too. First, they'll bury you in the algorithm, then they'll defund you, then they'll deplatform you. That's just the way that these things go. And we use these platforms while we can to do the work that we can to reach the number of people that we can get to. And we are always fully aware that one day that's going to get cut off, because the moment you get cut off, you know that's the moment that they've noticed you. So be sure to go and check out that article regarding the activities of GoFundMe and follow the instructions to support the Grayzone, because of course a lot of the stuff that we cover here is derived from work that Grayzone journalists have done, so they certainly deserve our support. And you can join Pink Floyd founder Roger Waters in supporting them as well, which will further annoy all of the right people, including Dave Gilmour, a great guitarist but a very terrible man, it seems. Right, so I'll say hello to those who have made it into the chat so far. So hello to Heidi, hello to Austin, hello to Red Star Betty, Peter, Morgan, Lee, and good morning to Ash down there in Melbourne. So we begin today, having done that announcement on the Grayzone situation, with a look at the, not the military situation in Ukraine this time, because the military situation hasn't changed dramatically inside the last 24 hours, it seems. So the principal thing I wanted to talk to you about tonight was, of course, the story that has come out in Bild, this German tabloid. It's a pretty ridiculous paper, but it released this interesting story about Schultz and Macron today. It's been covered in other places as well, that they were apparently shocked when they spoke to Putin last year that he didn't mention the sanctions, he didn't immediately start complaining about them, and that they were surprised about this. And you have to ask yourself just what job these people think that they're doing and who they thought they were talking to. Did they, first of all, really expect Putin, having weighed up all these options and finally been forced into launching the special military operation, to immediately start begging for mercy? Did he really strike them as that kind of guy? I don't think so. But the bigger surprise to me is, and I'm consistently surprised by this, is just how stupid and clueless the Western leaders really are. I mean, you grow up, and especially when you grow up believing yourself to be a radical, you assume that the men at the top of the ladder are lying to you all the time. As you develop your analysis and become more sophisticated, you believe that that there is the public face. As Hillary Clinton once said, there's a public position and a private position. And I believed for a long time that the public position might have looked ludicrous and ridiculous and was obviously a lie when it came to the pronunciations of most politicians. But I believe that in private, that they knew what was going on and were much more cynical and effective operators than we gave them credit for. And it turns out that I was being far too generous to these people, because we've seen over and over again, particularly now in the age of the internet, and now you get these like ridiculous, like, and I'm going to use the term advisedly here, bimbos like Trudeau and Macron, who are just don't appear to have a single brain cell in their heads. Like Trudeau, for instance, to digress to him for a moment, has or did have an important trading relationship with the Chinese that he chose to train wreck on the orders of the United States by detaining a Huawei executive for over a year. Then chose to train wreck it even further by leaking a conversation that he'd had with Xi Jinping to the Canadian press to make himself look good, which Xi Jinping, of course, found out about. And then you get that famous display of essentially Xi Jinping bollocking Trudeau, who looked like a scolded teenager. And why did Trudeau do that? He did that basically to score like really petty, cheap points with the Canadian press to generate himself some favorable headlines. He's that level of like low, petty, insecure little man. And then the same with Macron. Macron, it turned out, had been inviting French journalists into the room when he was speaking to Putin. And this was meant to be a confidential discussion. And so just on that level, well, why on earth would Putin want to have a conversation with Macron now, given that the story that's also come out is that now neither Macron nor Schultz nor Biden can actually get Putin on the phone? Well, if you knew that Macron was doing that, and you knew that these like ridiculous airheads were the people you were supposedly in dialogue with, well, why the hell would you bother? That's the surface level point to make. But the broader point to make about the fact that Putin is now refusing to speak to Macron and Scholz in particular is, well, why would you bother? Because, first of all, no matter what interpretation that you want to put on the failure of the Minsk agreements, and I've made my view on this clear before, I think that Merkel was doing what she always did when it came to difficult decisions, particularly difficult decisions that essentially would force her to make a choice between the relationship with the United States, with US imperialism, and the German relationship with Russia and or China, is that she tried to fudge the issue. That's what I think that was the downfall of the Minsk agreements, was that Merkel on one level wanted to maintain the profitable relationship with the Russians over oil and gas. And on another level, she was under extreme pressure from the American administration. Didn't matter whether it was the Obama administration or the Trump administration, the Washington permanent state, the deep state, whatever name you want to call it, the pressure from the permanent state of US imperialism was constant on Merkel and Hollande, and of course in the role that they were playing in Ukraine itself, to make sure those agreements weren't abided by. Now, Merkel, of course, could have taken a chance and pushed back on the Americans, but she chose not to, because she's doing what she always did, which is when faced with two powerful states, when faced with a difficult decision, fudge it. Say what each side wants to hear. And of course, she thought that by just kicking the can down the road, fobbing off the Russians, and basically just saying, yeah, whatever, and ignoring all the military buildup that the Americans were engaging in Ukraine and militarizing Ukrainian society, that eventually she wouldn't have to make these kind of decisions, and that she could always just fob the Russians off. And so therefore it came as a big surprise to Merkel when, of course, Putin stopped taking her seriously and started bringing Lavrov to their meetings, which prior to that had always been one-on-one. So Minsk fails essentially because the two supposed guarantors of it were in no position to either to force the Ukrainians to abide by it, and also had no desire to force the Ukrainians to abide by it. And then, of course, Hollande and Merkel came out and said, oh, yeah, we just lied to Putin anyway, which I still think was them rationalizing after the fact. I think what they were actually doing, especially in Merkel's case, was thinking that they could just continue tacitly agreeing with the Americans and fobbing off the Russians, and that Putin would continue to essentially just tolerate that. What Merkel completely failed to take into consideration was the evolving situation for Putin, politically speaking, inside Russia itself, which is that he was coming under more and more pressure to act with regard to the constant attacks on the population of the Donbass carried out by NATO. It's the Ukrainians might be the people firing the shells, but this is all done at the instigation of NATO officers, which is a tool of US imperialism. So perhaps the most accurate term to use for the shelling of the Donbass is that it's done indirectly by the US, which is ultimately the only player that matters here. And so if you're Putin, or if you're the wider Russian government, why on earth would you take anything the German government has to say particularly seriously, given that they put their name on this agreement? It went through the UN Security Council. It was meant to be enforced. It was never enforced. And then the person who signed this for the German government and the idiot who signed it for the French government turned around and said, oh, we lied about it anyway. Why on earth would you want to have a conversation with those people? And also, putting this more broadly, why on earth would Putin actually want to bother engaging with Biden? Biden has, of course, a 50-year-long career as a professional liar. That's expected in a bourgeois politician, especially in the American system. But Biden, of course, is notorious for not even being a particularly good liar. Notoriously, he had to withdraw from the 1988 presidential race because he plagiarized speeches by Neil fucking Kinnock. Of all the people to plagiarize, that loser. And Biden, of course, has a very shaky relationship with the truth, and he's notorious for it. And this was before he even started losing his marbles. So, of course, the incident to which I'm referring with regard to the discussion between Putin and Biden was when Biden was giving Putin assurances about, oh, I'm not going to put missiles in Ukraine. And then, of course, when they had another conversation about it, Biden denied ever having said that. Now, Biden may have forgotten, or he may have been told, or may have gone into the national security system who said, well, the whole reason why we're doing this is to be able to put those missiles in Ukraine to increase the pressure on Russia, so we can't give that assurance, and we're not going to. So again, like Biden and the French and German leaders are all proven to have lied very directly about this situation. So again, why on earth would the Russians engage with them? Now, the other factor here is, of course, that when it comes to the French and the Germans, well, why would you bother talking to them anyway, given that they've proven over and over again that they're not any longer any kind of serious power in the world, that they are, of course, completely subjugated before US imperialism, that they are unable to defy US imperialism because they are completely in thrall to it. And I've covered before on various different programs the fact that despite the enormous importance of Chinese manufacturing to the German economy, the massive importance of the American market for as a destination for German manufactured goods gives the US imperialists an enormous amount of power in Germany. It also, of course, has to be considered the long-term impact of a now nearly 80-year-long occupation of first West Germany and now a unified Germany, and the effect that has in terms of the domination that the US has, not just over the German government, but also its key security institutions. So this is all part of the mix that's going on here. And what you have to consider properly here is that the Putin government is under pressure itself inside of Russia to actually do something. And the absolute no-no from the Russian government's perspective is that they are seen to be conceding to people who've now got a long track record of leading them up the garden path. And we now go back to, of course, one of the cruxes of the conversation that apparently Macron and Schultz had, according to Bild, which was all about why isn't Putin complaining about the sanctions? Well, let's examine that for a moment. Putin, and this by Putin we're now referring to the Russian government as a whole, because although Putin, of course, is a tremendously important figure within the Russian government, and the man who is the consensus builder within it, he is by no means the only man operating within it. Now, nor is he the cartoon dictator that his enemies portray him as being. So what you need to bear in mind here is that the way in which the Russians responded to sanctions has a 10-year history almost. Has at least, before the start of the special military operation, it had an 8-year history, which was that the sanctions that started to be piled upon Russia started in 2014. They started as soon as the Ukrainian civil war began, which was, of course, around about April 2014. And it was Obama who started piling the sanctions on. And then both the Trump administration and the American Congress continued to do so. So the Russians had 8 years to prepare themselves. And before that even, the fundamental changes in the Russian economy have to be tracked back since at least 1998, which were that the first 8 years or so, 7 to 8 years of Putin's time in office, his first 2 terms as president, what was he focused on in that time? Principally, it was securing the viability of the Russian state. And by that I mean he had to, of course, win the war in Chechnya and bring that to a close despite the active interventions of the CIA and MI6. And, of course, he had to make sure that the Russian state machine could function. So he had to get in place a functioning tax system. And of course, he does his deal with the oligarchs, which is that they can continue to essentially move their money out of the country and overseas, as the KPRF frequently complains about, but also that he was going to institute a flat tax system, which the libertarians loved Putin for a little while. But what that meant was that he put it in place basically as a trade-off with the oligarchy, that they would pay some taxes as long as it was not a lot. So securing the state machine, ensuring the remit of the Russian state ran to every corner of the country, making sure that the state carried out basic functionality. That is, of course, Putin's aim for his first 2 terms. And by the end of his second term, just before, of course, the Georgian War, which was one of Medvedev's first acts as president, Putin addresses the Munich Security Conference famously in 2007 and is confident enough to say and issue a warning that directly to the United States that you can no longer essentially take the piss out of us, that we have secured our state, that we have weathered these challenges, that we are ready as one capitalist nation to another to do business with you, but you have to essentially treat us as a sovereign state and as an equal. And of course, John McCain and Joe Lieberman, if you remember him, were there in the front row chortling away. And immediately after that, the next year, in fact, you get the Georgia War, which is where, of course, the Bush administration pushed their puppet lunatic Saakashvili into starting the war in South Ossetia, and, of course, leading to disastrous results for Georgia and Saakashvili ultimately. So the Putin government's first 2 terms secured the viability of the Russian state. Then we get to the period between 2008 to 2012, which is the Medvedev interregnum. He gets a reputation as something of a liberal. Well, you wouldn't believe that these days by looking at his rather epic trolling Telegram channel. But then Putin returns to absolute consternation from the Obama administration in 2012, who, of course, were hoping that their man Navalny would be able to do some sort of color revolution in Moscow. Completely failed to do that, of course. Now, bear in mind that Putin's direction of travel and the Russian government's direction of travel has been constant in securing the viability of the state. Then after the 2008 crash, they had to reconstitute their economic policy again. And so they're already moving in the direction of a much more state-directed economy by the time the sanctions start in 2014. In fact, it had been moving progressively in that direction, I would argue, since 1998, even before Putin came into power. So the reason I give this background is that when Putin was faced with the sanctions situation, he already had plans in place to move to a more developmentalist model of the state, and of course then make Russia self-sufficient when it comes to agriculture, which involved reviving Russian agriculture, again through a lot of state intervention, and of course reviving Russian manufacturing, which had been annihilated by the compradors in the 1990s, to the point now where the Russians have now finally started producing their own domestic airliners again, under the Russian state-owned airline manufacturing corporation. So again, like, it took them a long time to nearly a decade to stabilize, and then of course they were able to use the fact that they were still a very big oil and gas trading company to funnel the receipts from that to different areas of the economy, to use state corporations to develop manufacturing areas and agriculture again. And by the time we actually get to 2022, there was a decent amount of academic literature produced in the English language that anybody could have read to let you know exactly what the Russian economy had done with regard to the changes made by the government since 2014 and the level of self-sufficiency that had been achieved in agriculture. You could have observed quite easily the moves the Russians had made in terms of diplomacy to secure themselves alliances to the south and the east, so they wouldn't be reliant upon just the trading relationship with the west. So that Schultz and Macron, and to a lesser extent probably Biden as well, actually thought that this would lead to a complete collapse of Russia shows a fundamental and idiotic misunderstanding of the situation. They had managed to miss all of the developments in the Russian economy since at least 2014. They had managed to miss the developments in the Russian economy since 1998 because they actually thought, it appears they had a genuine belief that it would cripple the Russian state, society, that would destabilize Putin. They genuinely had huffed their own fumes to the point where they believed that this would happen. Now, of course, apparently the Russian government was unsure as to exactly what would happen when the mega sanctions kicked in, but they'd had 8 years to plan for it, to game it out, and their planning seems to have so far been successful. And therefore, you have to ask the question, like, well, on one level, clearly, the Western planners do understand the processes that have gone on in Russia, because that's the reason why, or it's the key reason why, the hostility has increased every year. It's not just that they don't like Putin, it's that Putin's time in office coincides with the solidification of the Russian state, when, of course, they were getting very close to the objective that Herr Fehlinger has talked about so much, and then, of course, rather humiliatingly had to deny that he was a NATO official recently, after a lot of Brazilian journalists got wind of a map he took from a Redditor and said that NATO wants to break up Brazil. And then he had to deny it all after essentially he got called out by the Brazilian press. Very funny tweet from Herr Fehlinger today. But the point here is that the planners in the US State Department, those bow tie wearing weirdos who turned up to testify against Trump, well, they were all thinking that towards the end of the 90s, well, this is it. We are at the point where the final objective, which is the one that we didn't quite achieve in 1991, which is the shattering and disintegration of Russia itself, we're getting close to it. And indeed they were. The remit of the Russian state was getting weaker and weaker, which is why, of course, those elements in the national bourgeois who had turned on Yeltsin empowered first Primakov and then Putin to essentially put the compradors back in their box and then slowly ease them out and prosecute the worst of them. And it's at that point, when the Russian state becomes solidified again, that you start to see the hostility increase. So on some level, the imperialists and their planners and their analysts do understand the process that's gone on in Russia. They do understand that the Putin era represents a solidification, first of all, and then an expansion of the Russian state into in the economic sphere, and then a further expansion in terms of economic activity, which is overseen by the state, and the development of this strong interventionist state, which uses a variety of different economic policies, but which I would say, broadly speaking, it has elements of Keynesianism in it. It has elements more of, shall we say, there are certain concessions to neoclassical theory in there that are worth remembering. Certainly the KPRF complains a lot about the fact that Nabulina, the Russian central bank, is essentially a similar type of figure to like Alan Greenspan or somebody like that. But the concessions to neoclassical theory seem to be mainly in the realm of monetary policy. The level of intervention in the economy and in industrial planning being carried out by the state is growing and growing and growing. And also, if you look at the influence within Russian policy circles of things like, there is a book floating around which a Russian official has written, which purportedly seeks to learn lessons from the unprecedented growth enjoyed by the Soviet Union between 29 to 55. And that's growing in influence in Russian policy-making circles on the economy. So, as is the example of course, China. So the Russian state is moving slowly but surely in the direction of a much more state-directed economy, certainly at the level of heavy industry, certainly at the level of manufacturing, when, of course, manufacturing influenced by war output has jumped I believe it's 11% in the last year. Russian economic growth remains around about 2%. Now, of course, I say again, on some level, the Western analysts do know a lot of this, but of course it's not percolating up to the idiots at the top, because it seems that all of our worst suspicions regarding the idiots at the top are true, in that they spend all day smelling their own farts, that they have come to believe that the gas that they're breathing in is magic, that they have come to believe everything that the idiot op-ed writers in like the Guardian or the Telegraph or the Economist tell them is true, and that the analysis done by the more serious academics in the West, who do still exist, has completely passed them by, and that they were completely taken in by this idea that the war would be a dreadful mistake for Putin and they'd finally be able to get rid of him. This, of course, proved to be the exact opposite of the truth. And if anything, it would seem that the war has actually enabled those in the Russian state structure who favour a much more developed role for the state in the economy, burying for once and for all the close relationship with the European countries that Gorbachev was chasing after in a futile fashion, as was, by the way, Brezhnev, as was Kosygin back in the Soviet era. They thought that when they started selling oil and gas to the West, that this was their way of integrating themselves to a certain degree into the Western economy, and of course carrying out the plan that people like Kosygin really wanted to do, which was to properly restore capitalism in the Soviet Union. But if we get talking about revisionism, I'm going to be here till about 2 in the morning. Needless to say, the data that I've looked at, that a lot of other people looked at when it comes to analysing what had actually gone on in the Russian economy, what was actually the trend in the Russian economy, and the changes that the Putin government had made to secure it against the sanctions regime, none of that made its way into the closed circles of these idiots' minds. And that tells you that they're still essentially operating in a hermetically sealed bubble, which also tells you the truth about why they only negotiate with themselves. They keep failing to take into account at every single turn when they're talking about, well, maybe we can have a ceasefire, maybe we can freeze the conflict, maybe we can put what's left of Ukraine into NATO. They keep failing to actually take into account what the political situation in Russia is, because they still think that they can dictate terms to the Russian government, having completely failed to take into account that the Russian government will not listen to them. And it is they have been revealed as paper tigers. They can't and won't engage in a direct war with the Russians, so what the hell are they going to do? Even if this plan that they've got, that they're going to freeze the conflict, then put Ukraine in NATO, well, that's not going to work, because one of the biggest motivating factors for the Russian government issuing those negotiation points, which were meant to start a discussion process back in late 2021, was all about the stationing of missiles around Russia, and how they weren't going to tolerate these intermediate range missiles being stationed in Ukraine. And why on earth would they allow Ukraine to essentially escape the war now, go into NATO and the EU, and be turned into another outsourced military post yet again? There's no way that the Putin government was going to agree to that, even if the comprador elements within it were stronger and they wanted to go for that. Russian popular opinion would preclude that option. So this is all a utterly bizarre and self-reinforcing circle of idiocy that all these people are contained in. And what ultimately this war has done is to finally strip away any remaining sheen that countries like France and Germany still had in the world. Any remaining illusion that these were anything other than US vassal states has now gone for the majority of the world. I mean, for Europeans, apparently a lot of us are still so stupid to believe that a lot of Brits are still stupid enough to believe the EU is some kind of progressive fucking paradise. Yeah, well, leaving it was one of the best decisions that the British working class made. And again, I will go more into Brexit in future if there's a demand for it. But returning to the question, well, what are they going to do now? Macron apparently was saying, I'm prepared to act as an intermediary. Well, he's not an intermediary if he's arming one side, and the French state has been doing for many, many years. So again, the Europeans have now played no role at all in the settlement of this conflict. None. Barring a complete change of regime in Berlin or Paris or Rome, there's no way the Russian government is going to ever take them seriously if any of the combination of parties that are currently in office continue to be. And even if the AfD got into government tomorrow, which I would say is unlikely, then what actual change would occur? Given that we know very well that what happened with the fake populist Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who immediately just revealed her true colours as a slavish adherent of American imperialism. And I think there's a pretty strong guarantee, in fact, in the other direction with regard to the AfD, that many of their leaders are just as weak and susceptible to American pressure as the Meloni lot are. The whole question over, who would the Russians trust? I would say the only people that the Russians are going to be prepared to negotiate with ultimately is going to be the US government, because they're the only ones whose word actually counts on these matters, not the French, not the Germans, not the British, and certainly not the circle of cocaine-addled morons in Kiev. It is going to ultimately come down to, if there is any kind of discussion over this, an agreement between the leaders of US imperialism and the leaders of the Russian Federation, when it eventually does happen. Final point I would raise on this particular part of the discussion is that now we've got evidence that's come out of Kharkov today that the Ukrainian state is now calling up people who were previously held as essential workers. So there's photographic evidence that's been put on Telegram of workers on the Kharkov metro line, that's the subway system in Kharkov, receiving call-up papers. And now Danilov, the National Defense Secretary, I believe is his title, of Ukraine, just some moron who carries out NATO orders, really, has said that they're now going to go for full mobilization of the entire adult male population in Ukraine. Bear in mind, there's only about 27 million, if that, left in Ukraine. They've already had 400,000 odd casualties. So they're going to go for a mobilization and aim to mobilize what? At least another 300,000 men. There's talk of trying to mobilize 3 million men. Well, good luck with that. And also good luck with Zelensky's plan that they're going to go onto the defensive. How? Well, now that they've lost the best trained, best equipped units in their army, how on earth are they going to go on the defensive when, again, they've lost so much in this offensive, which has proven to be a complete and utter disaster, despite the fact that General Milley is going around lying about it? How are they going to go onto the defensive? Are they going to dig in with these 3 million men that they're going to call up from across Ukraine? How on earth do they think that this is going to go if the Russians, when the Russians do ultimately go onto the offensive? What are they going to do? They're going to give these guys guns and send them off in human wave attacks, which, by the way, was what they said the Russians were doing. I remember I think it was the Telegraph ran articles about how the Russians were using human wave attacks, and now it turns out that that's roughly what the Ukrainians are doing. They're sending men to run across minefields to act as human minesweepers. So this is the brutal reality of it, as I've stated many times before. So exactly what they're going to do with these millions of men they want to mobilize, who knows? But the key thing to bear in mind here is that this will now end probably at either where the Ukrainian state just collapses completely, or that Zelensky is removed in some sort of coup, or that the whole thing is pushed to the borders of Poland, because that seems to be the only that's what the Americans clearly have in mind, or what the American imperialists clearly have come to a consensus about, or within their own ranks, or that they can't agree on anything else. So they just hope to keep spinning it out. And if ultimately that means that Ukraine gets swallowed up completely by the Russians one way or the other, the American imperialists don't really care about that. nor do they really care if the French and the German governments are left with a completely destroyed economy, because they know that the French and the Germans have nowhere else to go. Right, I will pause now for questions and comments. So, hello to Irish Partisan out there in Minsk. Hello to Philbin. Hello to Makumi. Hello to Zuleika, Burke, RVA Klavik, Movie Maker Joe. How's it going? Didn't get an email about this, apparently. Well, I will double check the settings. Hello to Tusker. Hello to Sneaks. You'd think that we'd learn by now not to trust Austrians with map drawing obsessions. Yeah. I wonder if Gunter's a failed watercolour artist as well. Tusker asks, did the US go after Russia first to deindustrialise Western allies so it could amp up its war production capabilities to take on China? I would say that the Russian project is a longer-term plan than the China project. Now, ultimately, yes, there's always been the idea that they were going to turn on the Chinese at some point. The turn against China has been slower, though, because of the integrated role that it plays in US commodity production. And that's a very, very important role that they can't replace easily. And that, of course, has slowed down the hostility towards the Chinese. It's only amping up now because they're now making more efforts to get commodity production moved elsewhere, either back into the US or somewhere else that's more under their control. And the Russia project, though, is unfinished business from the end of the Cold War. And they started the plans to break up the Russian Federation almost as soon as the Soviet Union had collapsed. Remember, I keep bringing it up because it needs to be brought up. The Wolfowitz Memorandum of 1992, towards the very end of the first Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, the man who, along with James Baker, had said to that fucking moron Gorbachev, NATO won't move an inch to the east, where if you pull the plug on the Warsaw Pact. And of course, the miserable traitor pulled the plug on the Warsaw Pact, and it happened anyway. But the Wolfowitz Memorandum is significant because it states in plain language, and was written up, by the way, in the Washington Post at the time. It was leaked to the Washington Post. So they wanted people to know this, that they would never again accept a strong unified state on the territories of the former Soviet Union. And that, of course, includes the Russian Federation. So they kept Yeltsin in play to essentially do the job of destroying the state. They, of course, backed the Chechen militant Islamists campaign, which ultimately failed because the former leaders of the Chechen separatist movement, Kadyrov's family, turned on the jihadists and did a deal with the Putin-led government. But they were in there in Chechnya, that is the CIA and MI6. They were in Dagestan. They were operative, of course, all the way around the fringes of the Russian Federation. That map that Gunter Fehlinger was floating about on Twitter of a broken up Russia, that's not just something that a bunch of Redditors came up with. That's been a plan floating around the State Department, the CIA, the Foreign Office, and MI6 for a long time. Because, of course, the Russian Federation survived with an awful lot of the legacy of the Soviet Union intact in terms of its industrial base, its oil and gas production ability, and, of course, its nuclear weapons and its military production. And, of course, the legacy of the old Soviet Red Army still remains strong within the new Russian army. So for all those reasons, the Cold War's end was unsatisfactory. And so they continued their activities against the Russian Federation. And so to come back to Tusker's question, this started because this was something that has not stopped. Even when they were glad-handing Yeltsin and patting in the old drunk on the back and hoping that he train-wrecked the Russian state completely, they were, that it is the more permanent state in the US, no matter what Clinton did or didn't intend, was planning on leveraging every situation they could possibly find to secure the breakup of the Russian Federation. And that is what has been the case ever since. So look back 20 years ago, 2003 to 4, the Orange Revolution, overseen by the Bush administration, the Blair government, the Canadians were heavily involved in it as well. That was aiming to do in Ukraine what they did 10 years later. So this was a plan. They wanted to get to the point that they put Ukraine into 10 years before they managed to do it. Ultimately, this doesn't work because the man that they chose, Yushchenko, was a bit of a loser, and they weren't able to go as far as they wanted to, which is why the level of terror they imposed in 2014 was much more extensive, because they had to get themselves in a situation where they wouldn't be able to be turfed out of office the way that Yushchenko was turfed out in 2008. There's a strong body of evidence to suggest that he never actually won the presidential elections in 2004. The whole thing was redone basically as the Ukrainian state had a gun to its head being pointed by the fascists, with the CIA and the American imperialists themselves, of course, standing behind them. So this is a plan that's been in play for a long time. The turn against China came later, and they believe that the Russians will be easier to see off. Now, as to the part of your question that deals with the deindustrialization of France and Germany, deindustrialization is a natural process in capitalism. Whether they are allied with US imperialism or not, this would be a natural pressure that arises within capitalism. I've mentioned many times, because of course this is something which not enough Marxists talk about, it's the fact that Marx and Engels, because Marx wrote this in Capital Volume 2, the natural deindustrializing tendency of capitalism, the tendency of the capitalist to want to move from producing commodities to just moving money around. And this, of course, is most pronounced in the oldest capitalist power, being Britain, and the most advanced imperialist power being the USA. So the deindustrialization of places like France and Germany is something that was going on anyway. Now, German industry survived a lot longer because, of course, the German state was constructed slightly differently. The influence of finance capital was not as great as it is in France or in Britain, but France has been deindustrializing for a long time before this. So was the US plan to scalp their own allies and then go after Russia? No, I'd say the plan was they were genuinely confident that they were going to be able to destroy the Russian Federation, and then they would be able to either stick a new Yeltsin in charge or break the thing up entirely, and then, of course, impose their terms of surrender on whatever puppet government emerged in Russia. And they have a shadow government, a shadow Russian government supposedly in exile, because this was a bunch of exiled oligarchs who spend most of their time in townhouses in London, who are never going to get anywhere near power in the Russian Federation, of course, but they were hoping that they could engineer some sort of situation which would see something like that rise to power, so that then they could, of course, loot the resources of the Russian Federation, asset strip it, do to Russia what they've done to Ukraine, reduce it to the status of basically a neo-colony, and then along with the benefits that would be reaped by US imperialism, the mini-imperialisms, the smaller imperialisms of Britain, France and Germany would get their cut of the spoils as well. That was the plan. That was the plan. That was the reason why they were all going along with it, or a big part of the reason anyway. And as to the US destroying German and other European industries, that's a side benefit. That's a benefit that has come along because the US now thinks, well, if we're going down this road, we need to make sure that Germany can never become a problem, and therefore the EU can never become a problem. Now, I would argue the EU has never been too much of a serious problem for the US. Now, there were various different points when there were differences of opinion, the Iraq War being the most prominent of them. But the EU, and particularly the driving force of the EU, which is Germany, under its current regime, under its current political system and the balance of forces within that political system, was never going to seriously defy the US imperialists for anything other than like a tiny amount of time. And of course the US worked relentlessly to make sure that every shred of defiance was drained out or beaten out of the German political system, and it used every tool at its disposal to ensure that they ended up with a man as weak and pathetic as Schultz in the chancellorship. So yes, I mean, they may gain something out of the deindustrialization of Germany, but I would say that German capital, if it exits the country in significant numbers, which it's looking like it might, it's more likely to go east than west. The US might gain some immediate benefit by selling more liquefied natural gas to Germany. But in terms of if you're a German manufacturer and you want to go and set up a more profitable business, well, you're not going to go to the USA where the labor costs are still too prohibitively high. And you're not going to want to go over there and set up like the kind of very expensive, fully automated factory that could avoid you the cost of employing large amounts of labor. What you're going to do is you're going to go east. You're going to go to Vietnam. You're going to go to Thailand. You're going to go to maybe even Cambodia or Indonesia. So, or maybe not China at the moment, but there's plenty of other places in Southeast Asia where the labor is skilled, but the wages are still low. The cost of labor is still comparatively cheap. So that's my rather long answer to your question. Well, glad you appreciated it, but it's an interesting question. I think that the tendency amongst some more bourgeois commentators to state that this was always the plan of US imperialism, they were always planning to destroy Germany, I mean, that's overstated. I think it's the concern of US imperialism to make sure that none of its allies ever raised themselves to the status of being potential rivals. That's always been true. That's why they forced the Plaza Accords on Japan in the middle of the 1980s. And that played a role in, of course, crippling the Japanese economy. And then, of course, they scalped the Japanese microprocessor industry by the early 1990s, stole it all and took it back to the United States. They're doing the same thing with Taiwan, by the way. Interesting things keep repeating themselves. So, Ash says, you're saying we shouldn't believe John Bolton. He says Putin will be back in 2 months for a negotiation. I think John Bolton's relationship with reality is rather shaky. I think that John Bolton is a cynic. I think that, does he believe some of the things that he says? Maybe not. I think his interest really is in, I think his interest when it comes to Russia is still the same interests he's always had, which is breaking it up as far as he possibly can. And he's part of the most hardcore section of US imperialism, the most militant US imperialists. And of course, he's urging them on because he thinks mistakenly that if they just keep this thing going, that something will turn up. Or he's paranoid about the fact that it seems that things are slipping in Ukraine right now and that they can't afford a full-blown collapse. If Ukraine collapses and the Russian tricolor ends up flying over Kiev and the US is seen scuttling out of its embassy, that's going to be tremendously damaging. I think what Bolton wants is to keep up the pressure within the US political system to make sure that the administration and the Congress remains committed to backing up Ukraine so that they avoid this collapse. I think that's the game that Bolton is actually playing. Do I think Medvedev will be Putin's successor, or will Putin have to run again? I thought for a while last year, to answer Ash's question, that Medvedev was going to become president again at the next election, so next year, 2024. And I thought this because I figured that Putin had completed the tasks that he had set himself before he became president, that the Russian state was strong enough, that the Russian economy was restored. Now I don't think that Putin's going to go until this business in Ukraine is completed. I mean, Lukashenko intimated that Putin was going to run again. I think that the Russian hierarchy were having this internal discussion. I think for the purposes of continuity, I think Putin's probably going to run again. I think that he will be very aware of the need for continuity. Medvedev's still a fairly young guy. He's only in his late 50s, I think. So, like, even if Putin serves another 4 years, Medvedev would still only be like 62, 63. And, you know, that's still young enough to serve another term as president. So, if anything, he's improving his reputation with the Russian population by doing all this trolling on Telegram. So, if this is still going, by the time we get to the Russian presidential election, if the war is still going and the situation is still uncertain, I think Putin will stay on. He'll want to provide a level of continuity, and also he won't want to duck out and be seen to be retreating in front of the West. And I think that he'll see that as given that the man's concern for his career has been stability and continuity. I think he'll go again just to provide that again. But I think one more term is all he's probably going to do. Then he's probably going to retire once this situation in Ukraine is secured. But we will see. I could be proved wrong again on that one, and we end up with President Medvedev doing epic trolling that would put Trump to shame on Twitter. But yeah, my suspicion is at the moment that he's going to run again. Philbin says, it is astonishing US and NATO managed to convince Western press with a straight face that it was Russia who would have a manpower shortage before Ukraine. That is one of the stupidest assertions that they made, and based literally on nothing, based on just complete fantasy. But then again, much of what they say is based on complete fantasy now. Jay Londono says, with regards to the point that resolution of the conflict boils down to talk between the leaders of the Russian Federation and USA, what if ultimately there is no leadership in the US that can have that conversation? It's a good question, Jay. My guess is that if it is the case that the administration simply refuses to negotiate seriously and just keeps trying to sustain this conflict, then there'll be, given that there's no possibility under the current political leadership of France or Germany or Italy or any of the major EU players of any independent action, given that the regimes in Romania and Bulgaria aren't worth taking seriously at all, they're just pure puppet regimes. The Poles are just their only concern is trying to grab Western Ukraine and turn it into the glorious reconstituted Polish Commonwealth. But then again, as I've said many times, they can only do that if the US agrees to back them up fully. And the US ain't going to back them up fully. The US is going to do something much more cynical, which is, again, try and spin this out as long as they can. So what happens if they spin it out as long as they can? Well, what happens is the Russians just keep churning through Ukraine. There's every indication coming that the Russians are going to do another call-up, maybe later this year or early next, of another 300,000 men at least. Now, bear in mind, there is now a story going around in US independent media circles that Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter and others have commented upon and seem to confirm that there's at least an army of 300,000 Russians that hasn't been deployed yet so far. So if they've got 300,000 that they've not fully put into action yet, or that they're holding in reserve, they're apparently getting thousands and thousands of volunteers per week join the Russian army. That support for the war only increases as US hostility increases, and they are calling up another potentially 300,000 men later this year, early next. Then they're going to have an army that's close to or just over 1 million. That's probably, when it gets to being over 1 million, that's the point when you can, I think, start to consider them launching some kind of assault to end the war definitively. And at that point, the only question is, well, how far do they go? Do they then just drive all the way up to the Polish border? I'm now coming to the conclusion that that's how it's going to end, because it's not that the US particularly wants them on a strategic level to go and sit on the Polish border. But on the other hand, if you're a cynical bastard like Jake Sullivan or some other State Department goon or Pentagon ghoul, you might say to yourself, well, we wanted missiles on the border of the Russian Federation. We've put the missiles in Poland. We've got missiles on the border of the Russian Federation, because now the border of the Russian Federation goes all the way up to Poland. And we've achieved our objective. Now, that damns Ukraine. That leaves hundreds and hundreds of thousands of, possibly more, possibly in the end over 1 million Ukrainians could die. But why would the planners in Washington care about that? If they ultimately aim
to just try and get the Russians to expend as many men and resources as possible, and then to run a fascistic insurgency there as they did after World War II, then it doesn't matter, does it? And they don't need to acknowledge that the Russians have won. They can just say, we don't acknowledge this at all. They can acknowledge the border sort of de facto. Yeah, it's going to cause the Poles to sweat, but then again, that just means that you can reinforce your control over Poland even more. Bear in mind, these people aren't thinking long term. Ultimately, the Poles might be left with their dicks in the wind, but it doesn't matter to the people in Washington. So in the end, you may end up with the American imperialists watching and trying to get the conflict to spin out to the point where the Russians have to go all the way up to the border. The Washington ghouls then say, well, this war appears to be over, but we don't see it as over. We're gonna help Ukraine fight for freedom, etc. We acknowledge this government in exile. The hero Zelensky runs the freedom struggle from his villa in Miami. We now go over to a live show with Stephen Colbert, where him and Zelensky are going to play the piano with their dicks together, or something like that. You can see how this would play out. But ultimately, yes, I think it ends that way, with the Americans just simply refusing to acknowledge that it's over. There may be an under-the-table sort of tacit understanding that, well, that's it now, and that the Americans will try and run an insurgency and ultimately fail. But that may be the end. Philbin says they forgot about the logistics of what was the Red Army. Very true. Jay Londono says, that is, does the cornered U.S. bourgeoisie finally press the big red button, escalate conflicts in the Taiwan theater? Well, I think with Taiwan, the question there is, and this is what makes it a little bit more difficult for the U.S. imperialists, is that there are forces, even within the Taiwanese bourgeois, who don't want Taiwan turned into Ukraine. Because there are some forces, other forces in the Taiwanese bourgeois, the compradors, the ultra-compradors, shall we say, who are more than happy to see Taiwan turned into a version of Ukraine. That's certainly something that they're happy with, because they'll just get on the next jet out to Japan and then ultimately go into exile in the US. There are others, though, in the Kuomintang party, and there's even a guy who was an executive of the Foxconn company who's now starting a run for the presidency, stating that he doesn't want Taiwan to be turned into Ukraine. So there's divisions between within the Taiwanese bourgeoisie themselves over what to do. Probably more divisions than there were inside the Ukrainian bourgeois. Now, of course, the US could play all manner of dirty tricks, could try some sort of color revolution in Taiwan to get their guy back, or woman in the case of President Tsai, back in charge again. But because there's these divisions at the top, these will, of course, be replicated all the way through Taiwanese society. So we could see a move from the Taiwanese government, if it comes under the control of the KMT or some other force that is more inclined to take a independent view, that they're going to re-engage in negotiations with the People's Republic of China over reintegration of Taiwan into China itself. And if that happens, then the US will be denied their war. And so there's going to be an intense struggle inside Taiwan itself over its destiny. And we can only hope that the section of that the Taiwanese proletariat has a role to play in this as well, because if they refuse to go along with the compradors' plan to essentially reduce Taiwan to a smoking pile of rubble on behalf of US imperialism, then there's got to be a chance of actually stopping this in its tracks. And if US imperialism is stopped in its plans for war with China over Taiwan, then that creates a lot of problems, because Taiwan is the most obvious fault line upon which the US can press. They've tried it in Xinjiang and it hasn't worked. They tried all kinds of shit in Hong Kong. That didn't work. They're going to try all kinds of things in the rest of the country too. Again, this is something which might not work out very well for them. Taiwan is their best chance of actually starting a war. The Chinese initially, of course, would find it potentially difficult to persevere through, because the US has, according to most independent analysts, still a naval advantage. But then again, the Chinese are rapidly developing their own systems, particularly in the form of missile systems and their own naval forces to compensate for that. But the point I want to emphasize is that it's still avoidable. The Taiwanese proletariat can play a role in making sure that the compradors get brought down. There's divisions even within the bourgeoisie in Taiwan about the way forward. We got to hope that those divisions play out in the right way, and that the Taiwanese find a way to negotiate their way back into China with the government in Beijing, which, by the way, always wanted to reunify on the basis of essentially another one country, two systems deal. That was the long-term plan. The Chinese Party, the Communist Party of China, and the current leader and general secretary, of course, Xi Jinping, in all of the speeches and writings that he has put out there regarding relations with Taiwan, has said over and over again that what he ultimately seeks is reunification through negotiation. And the whole thing is a lie from the U.S. perspective that the Chinese were going to go into some kind of war footing to reconquer Taiwan. When, of course, the plan has always been to engage in long-term negotiations to draw Taiwan back into a unified China again. And by the way, there's a reason why there's so much support for that, even within the Taiwanese ruling class, is because the Taiwanese ruling class has actually been making a lot of money in China for many, many years. Back in the 80s, they were the ones who were, of course, some of the first investors into the special economic zones in China in the Deng Xiaoping era. So the Taiwanese bourgeois themselves were looking to get themselves a deal where they reintegrated into China and continued to make money through this arrangement. So one country, two systems deal could have suited them just fine. It avoids, of course, the horrific consequences of a war. So again, this is all based on lies and bullshit, and the Taiwanese can get themselves out of this by essentially kicking out Tsai Wen and the Democratic Party that are just slaves of U.S. imperialism, and ultimately kicking out the U.S. So it's avoidable, basically, is my point to Jay Londono's question there. President Jesus asks, what would Trump being kicked off the ballot mean for the state of bourgeois democracy? Well, an awful lot. I will come to that in just a moment. Junior Cadiz says, yes, Bolton's relationship with reality is rather shaky. Georgi Vlad, thank you for the, I believe it's a super sticker there. Answer to your question of how's it going is, it's going pretty well. Enjoying the stream so far. Hope you are as well. Georgi says, I've been seeing a lot of references to neo-Marxism in the Romanian news. What does this term mean? Well, basically, there's two things it could be referring to. Without seeing the articles concerned, I can only give you a general answer. What it actually refers to in Marxist literature is the school of Marxism started by the so-called Frankfurt School of people like Jürgen Habermas, people like Fyodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, others of the Frankfurt School, who were very influential in the New Left in the 1960s. And that's one thing it refers to. The people like Jordan Peterson and various sort of professional right-wing commentators, anti-communists, etc. these days use it to refer to all manner of like woke stuff. So I did an audio episode on the various different iterations of what cultural Marxism means. Generally, what people like Peterson use cultural Marxism and neo-Marxism interchangeably. So that could also be what it refers to. If it's right-wing press that's using the term neo-Marxism, they're probably using it to refer to like woke stuff, which they always accuse of being Marxism or communism, etc. If you'd like me to, I can do a more exhaustive exploration of that, Georgi, in the future. I could put it into the Saturday question and answer session if you'd want. Please indicate in the chat whether you'd like me to do that, because I'm happy to reiterate the points there. Junior Cadiz says, just as a side note, although the US military is weak and pathetic in numbers, and artilleries, why wouldn't they support the insignificant French military in Niger? Because they want the ECOWAS countries to do it for them, to answer your point there. They would rather not get directly involved because mainly a lot of their resources are tied up in Ukraine, but also from a PR perspective, the US and the French don't want to be seen leading an imperial expedition into Niger to overthrow what is a popular government, and also one that is receiving the support of the masses who are mobilizing and arming themselves to support it. So for those reasons, the US and the French don't want to move themselves. They'll support ECOWAS with arms and money, and they hope to get the Nigerians and the Senegalese and others to do the dirty work for them so that they can claim that they weren't directly involved themselves and therefore it isn't imperialism. That's what they'll claim. And this is why they're pushing Bola Tinubu, that corrupt hack who runs Nigeria. They're trying to push him into doing it for them, which of course could have devastating consequences for even the puppet regimes in Nigeria and Senegal and places like that, because they could destabilize their own countries. So, David Green says, in recent days, the NYT has been obsessed with the alleged economic crisis in China. What's going on? Well, essentially, there is a slowdown in the Chinese economy. It's not gone back to the heights it was 10, 15 years ago, which is like nearly getting on to 10% growth a year. But this slowdown's been going on a while. I mean, the slowdown actually started in 2008. The rate of growth of the Chinese economy progressively went downwards, and it's not got back to its pre-COVID level, but it's not got back to its pre-2008 level either. It's always going to slow down. Now, the recent obsession of all the bourgeois commentators with the slowdown in China is, well, there's a number of reasons why the Chinese economy has slowed down. Part of it is that they're reorientating. They're reorienting their economy around developing their own internal consumption more. See, they've overcome absolute poverty, and you see, and the Chinese government does this in a lot of its propaganda as well. You see these very futuristic cities being publicized on social media networks, and of course everything is propaganda. They do have these things. They do have these very futuristic areas of the country, but the flashy cities on the coast and places like Shanghai and some of the bigger towns inland as well, some of the big cities you've never heard of even, they don't represent the broad life for most of the overwhelmingly working class and peasant country that China remains. So what the Chinese leadership is actually doing is trying to reorient things to develop their economy internally onto the next level, to move away from just being a export-driven economy, which is integrated very much with the US in terms of being the US's premier commodities supplier in terms of manufactured goods. And they know now that time is coming to a close, and it's left them overexposed to pressure from the United States. And the US is trying to put a lot of pressure on the Chinese economy by restricting technology flows into China, trying to restrict capital flows into China. So what you've actually got is the US imperialists have triggered a process that was going to be necessary anyway, which was that the Chinese, if they wanted the system as it is to survive and continue and to reach their objectives of a moderately prosperous socialist country by 2049, they're going to need to do some reorientation. They needed to reorient their property market, which had become, of course, something that was riddled with problems. I mean, remember all the fear-mongering stories over Evergrande, the property company that was apparently going to destroy the entire Chinese economy, and it turned out that it wasn't going to. Well, they were reorientating their policies with regard to housing there, which is why essentially the Chinese government said that the big investors, the big real estate speculators in China, had to make a loss and take a haircut, because the new position of the Chinese party is that housing shouldn't be for the purposes of speculation and reaping great profits from. that it should be a response to the needs of the population. Now, that is a change in policy. That's a more pro-worker shift in policy, because 15 years ago, when they were doing that big construction plan that was there to act as a huge stimulus to get them over the turbulence from the 2008 crash in the West, it did become a speculative commodity. And now it became a problem, and now they had to reorientate the housing policy, which is why they were going to basically getting a lot of investors to take a loss over Evergrande and other things. And now they're having to reorientate things to boost internal consumption and slowly move away from being purely export-led to being an economy which can be sustained by domestic consumption. And that's going to basically mean a hit on the economic growth. How could it not? And from reading everything that's being, or a lot of what's being said internally in China from Xi and the other leaders, and from the party announcements that go out, it's a big campaign that they're engaging in across the country. They're engaging in this campaign to get the population ready for this new struggle that's going to be needed to engage in with regard to changing the economy away from being export-driven to investing internally and boosting internal consumption, and also focusing on their projects on the new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, whatever you want to call it, reorientating their trade, both, and they're boosting internal consumption and reorienting their trade away from the West. So this is all what is going on in China, and you combine that with the undeniable impact that the US sanctions are starting to have inside China. The whole question of the relationship of China with the rest of the advanced capitalist nations is under review and is changing. So this is what is actually going on. Now, the fact that the NYT has become obsessed with the idea that this means some kind of coming collapse, I mean, it's desperately huffing copium, basically, what the US and the British are doing. The actual reality is being, it seems to me, fairly well explained inside China itself to the Chinese population by the Communist Party of China through its various different institutions, that they're explaining this is another phase of developing China. We have gone through a certain period. That period is now coming to a close. Now we are developing again. So I'll be talking about that more comprehensively in the future, though, because I think it deserves a whole episode to itself. Burke says, did Stalin have a revisionist turn after World War II? Is it true he had input into the British road to socialism? I can answer the second part of your question quickly. He did, but the input he had into it was to try and stop them turning to open reformism. Burke, if you don't mind, can I put that question into the Q&A on Saturday? Can you indicate in the chat if you're okay with me doing that? Philbin says, considering structure of PRC's consultative policy conference and the United Front consisting of several parties, it's not unrealistic to advocate a peaceful reunification of mainland and autonomous Formosa. Indeed, and Philbin's point there is correct, which is that China still does have a united front. There still are several parties operating in the Chinese system, of which the CPC is the premier ruling party, but there are other parties in the system. The KMT could re-enter into that system again as a minority party within it. And this would, of course, could be addressed by the Chinese leaders, as they do now, going back to Mao's writing in the New Democracy or People's Democracy period, and saying that the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, is the leading and guiding force in the government, but there are several other different factions, including capitalists, and we're working towards socialism, and we're working towards re-educating the capitalists to work for the nation, and we're pulling forward in this direction together. So yes, that's a very good point. So yes, but I will, before logging off tonight, I got to address, as promised, the Trump question. And now you'll be aware, how could you have missed it, given that I do believe we've got a number of Americans on the stream tonight, Mr. Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, and maybe a future president, maybe not, has been detained again, or detained briefly in Georgia, charged with electoral interference. There's many cases against him now. They were throwing cases against him for alleged harassment. Those were up in New York. They're now throwing cases up against him in Georgia for election interference. There's charges related to the Capitol events of January the 6th, 2021, all kinds of things. And as Marius pointed out in the Telegram discussion group, they're basically overcharging, legally speaking. They're like throwing everything they possibly can at Trump in order that he drops out of the presidential race. The whole question of Trump's future is, of course, one that is a little bit up in the air. But at the moment, it seems that they're absolutely determined that they're going to drown him in legal cases, drain all of his campaign money into legal fees, make sure that he can't get out on the road by clogging him up in court, make sure that his ability to actually campaign is severely restricted. And we come back to the old question of, well, why are they doing this? Because Trump, as a man, as an individual with a certain set of policies that he ran for the presidency on, which were moderate, included moderate protectionism, but his real difference with them on policy was over a tactical question, over whether they wanted to make war on Russia or China at the same time or separately. Trump favored a reconciliation with Russia in 2016, which of course because Russia was the longer term project, which even more people were invested in at that time than China, that's what caused the deep state freakout, because their plan was developing quite nicely in Ukraine and they didn't want Trump to get in the way of it. That's the basis of it. The broader factor is that US imperialism's internal political structure is becoming more and more unstable. It's becoming two things are going on at the same time. The structure is becoming more unstable because the crisis of US imperialism is deepening, and its ability to reap profits all the way around the world is being called into question. And at the same time, the structure is rotting because the economic system has become more and more unstable. The ruling class cannot afford any dissent within the political system. And so, therefore, any potential dissent has to be squashed. They were fortunate in that Bernie Sanders proved to be essentially a good boy and dutifully bowed out and endorsed first Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden, demoralizing and destroying his own movement in the process. Good lad, Bernie. I'm sure he's going to get his wish to die on the floor of the Senate at this stage. But the other question, of course, is, well, what about Trump? Now, Trump, as I said, reflected a more aggressive version of the emerging consensus within the ruling class over China, so it's hard to see why they'd have a problem with him over that. The big freakout, though, was, as I said, about Russia, and of course, more widely, the fact that he didn't come out of the very tightly controlled networks of either the Democrats or the Republican Party. He had mobilized a base amongst the American petty bourgeoisie. I'd say he generated a degree of enthusiasm within the minority of the working class, though, funnily enough, he got more working class votes in 2020 than he did in 2016, it seems. And the fact that he had this independent base, the fact that he wasn't strictly under the control of the party machine, although he never really did that much to defy them, the fact that he had the potential, never the reality, the potential for some kind of independent decision making outside of establishment control, even the smallest chance of that is what caused the US ruling class to have a gigantic freak out and, of course, pursue him through various fake investigations into the entirely fake and fraudulent Russiagate story for 4 years, and then gin up as many legal cases against him as they possibly could to stop him running again in 2024. Because, of course, it's now become an industry in itself, being anti-Trump, and it's the only thing that basically these posturing idiots and the left of the American Democratic Party have to actually campaign on. So hence the absurd sight of like that moron Raphael Warnock making like TikTok videos and trying to mock Trump for being arrested. What they don't seem to realize is that this also seems to be actually making Trump more popular in certain quarters. The question is, though, is this going to work? Is the plan of the American deep state to bury Trump in legal cases and to make sure that he can't run again going to work? Well, it may do. It may reach the point where his campaign just becomes impossible to run, that they drain it of money, that they drain Trump himself of enthusiasm. All of these things are possibilities, and it's certainly what they're gambling on. Could it be that they put off large elements of the more petty bourgeois, respectability politics obsessed Republican voter base with this? It's possible, but then again, those people weren't going to vote for Trump anyway, I don't think. I think a lot of those people have defected to the Democrats. So there's still every chance, in my view, that this blows back in their faces and that Trump actually increases in popularity. Whereas Biden, of course, he's unpopular, is not going to break any records in terms of enthusiasm for turnout. So there's every chance this blows up in their face. But given how relentless they're being, and they keep throwing the charges at him and they keep throwing them at him, I don't think they're going to stop until essentially his campaign falls to pieces. But as long as he remains on the ballot and as long as he remains the candidate of the Republican Party, which it looks like he is going to be, I would say he's still a danger to them purely on the basis of his existence. Now, had Trump, of course, bowed out in 2021, if he'd said after January the 6th and after the inauguration of Biden, fuck politics, I'm done with it, I'm going back to television. Well, as the comedian Tim Dillon rightly observed in one of his recent monologues, they'd have probably thrown a ton of money at Trump and welcomed him back into Hollywood in a few years with open arms. But the fact that he refused to do so has, of course, enraged them even further. And we're not dealing with a rational, calculating system here. As Marx observed a long time ago, capitalism is a system which is both powered and defined by its contradictions. And those contradictions start, of course, in the economic base, in the crisis of US imperialism, make their way into the political superstructure. And so the political superstructure itself is becoming increasingly irrational and increasingly bizarre. There's no way that you can see Trump really as a coherent threat to US imperialism. Not in any degree would he ever have intended to be. In fact, he's obsessed with the idea of having the greatest military on earth, and was open about the fact that he was going to continue to occupy Syria and steal the oil. I mean, that's part of the reason why they were mad at him. He was, going mask off on too many occasions. But the idea of him as some sort of threat to imperialism is a joke. The idea of him as a threat to US capitalism is a joke. Now, the threat it was that he could take some action that might destabilize things and might destabilize things by accident. That he wasn't the fact that he wasn't completely and utterly under control, even though he never really threatened to go far beyond the acceptable parameters of policy. The fact that the threat merely existed in the smallest sense is what sent these deep state freaks over the edge. Because again, like the American political system, because of it sits on top of this unstable system based on gigantic amounts of debt, then the political system becomes ever more desperate to secure stability at all costs. Because if you upset the apple cart, if you upset the fact that these systems, these gigantic amounts of fictitious capital, are what a lot of the American system is based on, and the British system, by the way. And if any deviation from the political norm can threaten to destroy that, or threaten to cause it to come into question, shall we say, that is why, of course, the deep state and various other associated bodies are so obsessed with complete control of the political system, complete ruling out of any alternative, complete marginalization of even the slightest hint of change. And it all comes from the fact that There is this instability. They're obsessed with control and stamping out opposition. But of course, through that obsession, they create more legitimation crises for themselves. Because what they ultimately have is a situation where they can't solve the problems and the contradictions within American imperialism. They can't do it without either an enormous attack on the working class, which they'd love to do, but they don't have the ability to carry it off at the moment, not in the way they'd want to, or massive acts of aggression overseas, which again they tried to do with this Russia thing, they would love to do with the China thing. They can't really do either at the moment. So they're left with this desperate need to keep the show on the road, and there lies the contradiction. The more they try and hammer down Trump, they may succeed in it, but ultimately at the cost of a further crisis of legitimation later on. I'll pause now for questions. Alan says, plan on doing a live stream or two on socialism and Chinese characteristics and the role of China in the world today. I do, and that live stream will take place, first one on Tuesday of next week, second one on Thursday of next week, to give time for questions in the middle. I will be scheduling them in and announcing them beforehand. So, Philbin says, there's a paradox. If Trump believed he was still legally president, why does he surrender to the courts? And if Dems viewed second-term Trump as threat to Republic, why not prioritize replacing Biden? Both excellent questions. The point about it is the contradictions here have mounted up to the point where the Democrats' own room for maneuver is too small. So, to deal with Trump first, if he believes he's still president, why is he surrendering to the courts? Well, partly because, I think partly because to actually defy the courts, in theory, if assuming that Trump is a slightly different character here, you could, if you were in his position, essentially say fuck you to the courts and the system and say, I'm not acknowledging your right to try me. I am still the president. The coup was against me, which he does say, but he doesn't do anything about, because to actually do what would be necessary to challenge what he regards as an unfairly stolen election would require him rallying his supporters in a way that would actually lead them into a head-on confrontation with the institutions of the American federal government. And that, of course, is something that Trump doesn't actually want to do. And so what we've got is a sort of strange situation where you have like a right-wing version of a sort of the same problems that you get with like social democrats. It's the problem that you get with social democrats when the in certain places in the world where the deep state basically comes out and rigs it against them, and they lead demonstrations, they make denunciations, and they wave their arms in the air, but they ultimately don't mobilize their supporters in a way that could actually threaten the control of the very forces they spend so much time denouncing. Trump's in the same situation, or a similar situation. If he wanted to challenge this, it's not going to happen through the courts. The courts are going to rule against him, just as the same way that the courts basically ruled against Al Gore for reasons that in 2000, because essentially the Bush faction had engineered the stealing of that election. Al Gore dropped out and conceded a defeat which he knew was false, because he was told by the deep state guys and the big guys in the Democratic Party, forget it, Al, they stole it fair and square, which means if you carry on challenging this, you're going to call into question the legitimacy of the presidency. You're going to call into question the legitimacy of the election process, the legitimacy of the federal government. And you can't do that if you're a political insider like Al Gore was his entire career. So, of course, Gore, being a good servant of the system, dropped out and recognized Bush as president, and everybody carried on. And didn't that work out well? By the way, it wouldn't have been that much different if Gore was president. But I'm using it as an example of what happened. Same with Nixon, 1960. Nixon was pretty confident that Kennedy and the Democratic Party operation had stolen the election. But he sucked it up because he's a loyal servant of the system. And to go out and say, this has been stolen from me, and to keep talking about it and to try and organize against it calls into question the legitimacy of the system again. Trump, by keeping talking about it and talking about it and talking about it, but not actually, and then he eventually organized a half-assed demonstration that got manipulated by the federal agencies. He did make the system look bad for a little while, because he had basically talked himself into a position where he had to provide some kind of challenge to it to retain the credibility with his supporters. But of course, to actually give it the full middle finger to the system isn't within Trump's politics or capacity. So essentially, what he's left with is that he's trying to essentially use the court appearances as mobilizing and fundraising for himself. And that seems to be working to a degree. But Philbin's point is correct, which is that if Trump was actually serious about challenging the system, even from a right-wing perspective, then what he'd have to do is say, I am not acknowledging any of these cases. I am still the president. Rally to me. Well, that means basically that they would have to try and arrest him for, I don't know, some kind of like subversion or treason charge, which again would be a massive escalation. Trump isn't stupid. He knows very, very well that if he does that kind of escalation, then he can forget about getting fined or a small prison term. Then he may end up in prison for a very long time, or he may end up dead. And so this is the road that we are on. Now, as to the Democrats replacing Biden, that would be the sensible thing to do. But then again, the reason why Biden is there in the first place from 2020 is that they didn't have anybody else. Now, they could swap him out with Newsom, assuming that they can basically tell Kamala to fuck off somewhere, because there's no way that she would be able to beat anybody, given that she's sort of rambling. She's supposed to be a rambling drunk mess most of the time. So, yes, replacing Biden with Gavin American Psycho Newsom would be a much more sensible thing to do from the Democrats' point of view. But it doesn't appear that they can agree on how to replace Biden or who to replace him with. Just as they couldn't agree in 2020 who to unify around to stop the Sanders campaign. And ultimately they ended up plugging for Biden, backing Biden, because he was the only one who had a name that wasn't Pete Buttigieg. They wanted it to be Kamala, but she was so ineffective and so unpopular that they had to drop her. And so the only one left standing, just about, was Biden. So again, like the contradictions in the American system, the decay in the American political system, the fact that the parties have become completely ossified, the fact that Trump is like the only politician who retains any degree of real popularity, all these things are combining together with the underlying crisis of American imperialism to create an enormous crisis that's going to damage, whichever way this turns out, it's going to damage the legitimacy of the American imperialist political system. How can it not? Even if they succeed in getting the corpse of Biden stuck back in the White House again for another 4 years and Trump sent to prison, or Trump destroyed by the legal cases and has to drop out or something, again, like a big section of the American petty bourgeois and the working class is going to be even more alienated from the political system than they are already. So the legitimation crisis of the American system continues because, again, the crisis underpinning it continues, which is the long-term crisis of American imperialism. Right. Junior Cadiz says, do we not speak enough about debt and its manipulation by the World Bank, IMF and regional organizations, frailty to it? It's a good question. That is one that I would like to put into Saturday's Q&A, if you can indicate whether you agree or not on that one. Philbin says, I learned the word anile because of Biden. His face should be next to it in all dictionaries. I have no idea what that word means. Jay Londono says, Alex, a recommendation for the Socialism with Chinese Characteristics talks. If you haven't, it would be useful and interesting to read the recent book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy by Isabella City Weber. I haven't read that one. I have read the Carlos Martinez book on socialism with Chinese characteristics called, I think, The East is Still Red. I've read the Harpal Bra book on socialism with Chinese characteristics. I will add that one to the list, though, and I've also read the Deborah Brautigan books on China's role in Africa. But yeah, the Isabella Weber book I'll add to the ever-growing reading list for that. Lord Charfield says Clinton and the mainstream media are still calling Trump's election in 2016 rigged. Well, yes, I mean, that's the obvious point to come back with, that Trump does come back with, which is, well, the Democrats said that the 2016 election wasn't legitimate. They said it for 4 years. They're still saying it. But there you get a classic example of, you say things that are in the interest of the bulk of the ruling class at any given time. That's not a problem. You do things that could even disrupt the system in the smallest of ways, and you're public enemy number one. Right. I'm aware I've run for an hour and 40 now, so I'm going to just, you know what? I'm going to again bump the NGO section into tomorrow's broadcast, because we're running out of time for tonight. It's been an hour and 45 already. Right. Thank you to everybody who has contributed tonight. So I'm just going to reel off. Thank you, first of all, to Georgi Vlad for the super sticker there. Thank you to all those who've tuned in. Heidi, Austin, Red Star Betty, Peter, Morgan, Lee, Ash, down there in Melbourne, Irish Partisan, Philbin, Makumi, Zuleika, Burke, RVA Klavek, Movie Maker Joe, Tusker, thank you for the good questions, Lavitz, President Jesus, Burke, and yeah, I think I've covered everybody there. Lord Charfield, of course. Okay, so some of those questions will go into Saturday Q&A, which will start at the slightly earlier time of 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, and will run for 2 hours at least, 1 till 3. Remember also Chinese broadcasts coming up on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, so be sure to put that in your diaries. Right, thank you to everybody who's joined in. You can find the full audio version of this program on the Patreon page, minus YouTube adverts, of course. Right, yes, in answer to Sneak's question, NGO is going to be up tomorrow. Okay, thank you everybody for tuning in. I'll return to you tomorrow.